So yes, hello. I hope that everyone is fine. Now you're listening the presentations. So the presentations or work for the sequence about the history over the sequence about the history of the United States. So all presentations is about the Cold War. We already know that the group of Damien, have present you the Cold War. But today, we'll try to present you the Cold War by another way, and we think that it could be easier for you if you had two presentations about one topic to better understand the Cold War. So yes, but first I want to explain you the plan of our presentations. So first, I will explain you the Cold War. What was the Cold War? So the point number one is the definition of the Cold War. After, also in the point number one, I will explain you the clash of ideologies. Now, you probably don't understand why I have to explain you the clash of ideologies, but the clash of ideologies is one of the most important thing in the Cold War. So we cannot explain you the Cold War without the clash of ideologies. After the point number one, Woody will explain you the point number two, so the origin of the Cold War. After Rudy, I will explain you the two major events of the Cold War, and after that, Woody will explain you the end of the Cold War. In our plan, after that, we have a count and a video, but we are not in class, and sorry for that. It's not our choice, but we cannot present you these presentations in class because we don't have the time. But you have the count, you have the link for the count and the link for the video that we had a plan to present you this in class, but we don't have the time, so you have the link in Smart School if you want. So yes, now I will begin the really definitions of the Cold War. So the Cold War was a time, we can even say that the Cold War was a very long period because it lasted more than 40 years. So it was a long period, when the United States and the Soviet Union, along with their friends, were very tense with each other. I really want to highlight that it was United States and Soviet Union along with their friends. So other countries were involved in this conflict. It was not only the United States and the Soviet Union, but the allies of the two countries were involved in this conflict. So the Cold War started in 1947 after World War II ended. And so 1947 is a time when there were a lot of after-war conferences, and these after-war conferences bring a lot of bad things for the world, a lot of conflict. And the Cold War lasted until 1991. Probably our parents were already in this world when the Cold War was in this world also. But even though there was not a direct war between the two sides, but they were often close to it, dealing with conflicts called hotspots in other parts of the world. The Cold War got its name because there was not actual fighting between the USA and the USSR, the Soviet Union. Instead, the USA and the USSR supported different sides in other countries' fights, known today as proxy wars. The conflict was mainly about which country would have more influence globally, because, like I've stated before, the World War was after the World War II, so everything had to be rebuilt, even the superpowers. So yes, the USA and the USSR want to have more influence globally, and this is why this conflict was so popular. Apart from building up their weapons and armies, They used other tactics like spreading ideas, spying, and competing in space explorations. The Cold War began when the Truman Doctrine, we will explain you the Truman Doctrine later in our presentations. So the Cold War began when the Truman Doctrine was announced in 1947 and gradually lessened with a split between the Soviets and China in 1961. The Cold War finally ended when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So this was the point number 1.1, the definition of the Cold War, and now I want to explain you the clash of ideologies. The Cold War, spanning from the aftermath of World War II until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, was a conflict characterized by intense ideological clashes between the Eastern and Western Bloc. You will understand later who was the Eastern and who was the Western blocs. At the heart of this conflict were two contrasting political and economic ideologies, so obviously capitalism and communism. First, I will explain you the Western camp, who was the Western camp, the ideologies of the Western camp, etc. In the Western camp, led by the United States and its allies, capitalism and democracy were championed as the pillars of societal organizations. Capitalism, rooted in principles of individualism, economic freedom, and limited government intervention, highlighted private ownership of the means of production and free market competitions. Democracy, meanwhile, emphasized the principles of popular sovereignty, civil liberties, and the rule of law, enabling citizens to participate in governance toward free and fair elections. Now, I will explain you the Eastern Bloc, the ideologies of the Eastern Bloc, etc. Conversely, the Eastern Bloc, headed by the Soviet Union, espoused the ideals of communism, advocating for collective ownership of property, central planning of the economy, and the pursuit of a classless society. Under communism, the state played a central role in economic planning and distribution, aiming to achieve social equality and eliminate class distinctions. So there we can highlight that the Eastern and the Western Bloc, so the United States and the Soviet Union along with their friends, advocating for completely other ideologies. They defended completely other ideologies, and this is one of the most reasons why these two sides don't have a good relation between with each other, because they defended other ideologies. But however, this system, so the communism, often resulted in authoritarian governance, restricting individual freedoms and dissent in the name of maintaining social cohesion and achieving revolutionary goals. So, for people who don't know, authoritarian governance is when one man on or one man and his group are in office for one country, for example. The clash between these ideologies, so between communism and capitalism, was not merely theoretical, but played out on the global stage toward proxy wars, espionage, and propaganda campaigns. I have a very good example of propaganda campaigns for those who don't know what is propaganda. So both sides sought to advance their respective ideologies, portraying themselves as champions of progress and freedom, while illustrating their adversaries as oppressors and aggressors. There you have a very good example of propaganda campaigns, because the USA characterized themselves as champions of progress and freedom, and they characterized the Soviet Union as oppressors and aggressors. Communism, with its highlight on solidarity, social justice, and revolutionary change, aimed to transform societies worldwide, offering an alternative vision to the inequalities and injustice perceived under capitalism. Meanwhile, capitalism touted its virtues of innovations, entrepreneurship, and economic prosperity, positioning itself as the guarantor of individual liberty and prosperity. Throughout the Cold War, these ideological battles played out in various arenas. From the arms race, so the two sides want to have a lot of weapons, a lot of arms, and the most modern arms. So from the arms race and space explorations to cultural exchanges and mm, diplomatic negotiations. The competitions between capitalism and communism shaped international relations, influencing alliances, conflicts, and geopolitical strategies on a global scale. Ultimately, the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, marking a triumph for capitalism and democracy in the eyes of many Western observers. However, the legacy of the Cold War continues to reverberate in, in contemporary geopolitics, shaping debates over economic systems, mm, polit- political freedoms, and the role of the state in society. So this was the point number one about the definitions of the Cold War and the clash of ideologies. And now Woody will present you the point number two, so the origins of the Cold War.
Okay, so now I'm going to be talking about the origins of the Cold War. So, first of all, we have the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. So, the Yalta conference took place from the 4th to the 11th of February 1945, involving leaders from the United States, the UK, United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. So, they met to discuss the future of Europe and Germany after the World War II, and the common goal was to establish peace and to reconstruct European nation after the war, because a lot of it was destroyed. However, with the beginning of the Cold War in 1947, the conference became very controversial due to different opinions and with the division of Europe into the Eastern and Western Bloc, which I will go into more details afterwards. The Potsdam Conference occurred from the 17th of July to the 2nd of August in 1945, with representatives from the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. They gathered to plan the post war peace and the administration of Germany after its surrender. Decisions included dividing Germany into occupation zones by the winners of the war. The conference also addressed issues such as peace treaties and addressing the effects of the war. The division of Europe and the formation of bloc following the Yalta and Potsdam conference played a huge role in the origins of the Cold War because they both initially aimed at promoting a post-war peace, stability, and cooperation, but unwittingly solidified the division of Europe into opposing spheres of influence and started a period of ideological and geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. This division of Europe into Western and Eastern blocs essentially started a conflict between the capitalist West and the communist East. The Western allies, so the West parts, led by the United States, had principles of democracy, individual freedom, and free market economies, which basically contrast sharply with the USSR communist ideology and authoritarian regime. This ideological contrast not only divided Europe, but also polarized the world, shaping alliances and hostilities on a global scale. The division of Europe and the formation of blocs is oh, never mind. Furthermore, the establishment of NATO and the Warsaw Pact also exacerbated tensions between the East and the West that transformed Europe into a battleground of ideologies and military strategies. NATO was formed as defensive alliances in response to the Soviet expansionism, that provided a security umbrella for Western Europe against any potential Soviet aggression. And in contrast, we have the Warsaw Pact that was comprising the Soviet Union and all of its European, Eastern European allies that served as a counterweight to NATO, and it basically consolidated Eastern Bloc's military capabilities and solidarity. The consequences of these developments extended beyond the border of Europe to influence diplomatic relations, military strategies, and proxy conflicts across the globe. The Cold War, with its ideological struggle and nuclear tension, became the defining feature of international relations in the latter half of the 20th century, shaping the course of history and leaving a huge impact on the contemporary world order. In essence, the division of Europe and the formation of blocs following the Yalta and Potsdam conferences were effectively the origins of the Cold War, marking a beginning of a new era characterized by ideological confrontation and geopolitical rivalry. Lastly, we have the Truman Doctrine that emerged from a speech that the President Truman gave to Congress on the 12th of March 1947. So it was prompted by Britain's decision to stop aiding Greece against communist forces. Truman asked Congress to support Greece and Turkey, fearing Soviet influence in the region. But despite the Soviet leader Stalin's lack of support for Greek communists, other events like the Soviet actions in Iran and Turkey strained US Soviet relations, and it shifted the US foreign policy towards actively aiding countries resisting communism. Truman finally argued that allowing communist expansion was a threat to global peace and US security. Then we have the Zdanov Doctrine, articulated by a Soviet politician named Andrew Zdanov in 1947, that marked a crucial moment in Cold War history. It depicted a world divided between capitalism and communism, with the US leading the capitalist West and the USSR, the Soviet Union, leading the communist East. Zdanov emphasized solidarity among communist nations and the global fight against imperialism. His doctrine framed the Cold War as an ideological struggle fueling mistrust and hostility between the East and the West. Um, so it is also considered the Cold War origin because it intensified the ideological divide between the East and the West, and Zdanov's speech portrayed the conflict as capitalism versus communism, shaping Soviet foreign policy and setting the stage for decades of geopolitical tension and proxy conflicts such as the Cuban crisis and the Vietnam War. We'll talk about the Cuban crisis a bit later in the presentation. By promoting solidarity among communist nations and cultural unity against the West, the Zdanov Doctrine helped solidify the divisions that defined the Cold War era. In conclusion, the Truman Doctrine and the Zdanov Doctrine were essential in shaping Cold War dynamics. Truman's policy of aiding nations resisting communism marked a shift in US foreign policy, while Zdanov's doctrine intensified ideological tensions between the East and the West. So, understanding these doctrines can really provide insights into the complexity of the Cold War history. So now I will let my friend explain the rest.
Okay, so now the point number three. So major events of the Cold War. In this point, I will explain you two events of the Cold War. First, I think the most important, the major events of the Cold War. So the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, and the second event of the Cold War is certainly not the most important, the major events, but it's the Berlin Crisis of 1961. But it's we've chosen the Berlin Crisis of 1961 because one of the most important moments in the Cold War history is the Vietnam War, but another group already presented you the Vietnam War, so we don't want to always speak about the same thing. And we've chosen the Berlin Crisis because we've been in Berlin last week, and we've seen a lot of important places for the Berlin Crisis in Berlin. Okay, so I will begin with the point number 3.1, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was a closely dangerous moment in the Cold War history, but also in the history of the whole world, because it's nearly led to a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And if there was a nuclear war, the whole world would be impacted. So this was why this conflict was a dangerously close moment in the history of the whole world. So the nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union is hopefully don't happen, but it was really close to it. Stemming from the tensions of the Cold War, the crisis arose when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, close to the US mainland. This move followed the Cuban revolutions and Fidel Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union, escalating this conflict, so the Cold War, in the Western Hemisphere. You probably ask now, what have the President of the United States done in these situations? First, the President of the United States at the time was John F. Kennedy. So John F. Kennedy was very, very popular, and even known he's very popular because he was very young. He was the youngest president of the United States, and he was also very pretty in the eyes of a lot of women and maybe men. US President John F. Kennedy discovered the missile site through reconnaissance flights and responded swiftly. He imposed a naval blockade around Cuba to stop further Soviet shipments. The world watched anxiously as both sides prepared for potential nuclear conflict. But hopefully for the whole world, behind the scenes negotiations. So behind the scenes negotiations is secretly negotiations, negotiation who was not very recorded and at the TV, etc. So behind the scenes negotiations, however, led to a breakthrough. So a breakthrough is a peace accord, something like that. But hopefully, so the accord between the two sides, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba and secretly remove US missiles from Turkey. The crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, highlighted the danger of nuclear brinkmanship and emphasized the need for effective communications and crisis management to prevent catastrophic conflicts between nuclear powers. The Cuban Missile Crisis bring something good to the world because it prompted effort to establish direct communication channels and led to the creation of hotline between Washington and Moscow, so the most important city of the United States. So we can say that the Cuban Missile Crisis bring a good thing to the world because it bring hotline. Additionally, it spurred renewed diplomatic engagement and resulted in arms control agreements, like the LNTBN of 1963, so the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. At the end, in the conclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a reminder of the fragile nature of global security and the importance of diplomacy and cooperation in maintaining peace. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 honors the courage and leadership of those who hopefully steered the world away from nuclear disaster, choosing reason and peace and restraint over escalations. Okay, so this was the point number 3.1, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And now I will explain you my last point, the point number 3.2, the Berlin Crisis. So the 1961 Berlin Ultimatum was a crucial moment in the Cold War, showcasing intense geopolitical tensions between the United States and Soviet Union. At the Vienna Summit, so the Vienna Summit is one of the after-war conferences where the winners were speaking speaking about the reorganizations of the world and about the reorganizations of the Europe. And so the after-war conferences bring a lot of conflict. So at the Vienna Summit in June 1961, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev demanded a separate peace treaty with East Germany, threatening to end existing agreements allowing Western access to West Berlin. This ultimatum, set for December 1961, raised concerns about the future of Berlin and East-West relations. So when I said East-West relations, I mean relation between East and West Berlin and relation between the East world and the West world. So the East world was the United States and the West was the Soviet Union. So it's a really good thing to explain East-West relation. Tensions heightened due to actions and statements from both sides. US President John F. Kennedy's concessions at the Vienna Summit in June 1961 seemed to accept the permanent division of Berlin, weakening US influence. However, Kennedy's public address in July 1961 reaffirmed American commitment to Western interest in Berlin. Plans for the Berlin Wall in East Germany, aimed at preventing mass emigrations to the West, added to the tensions. But the sudden closure of the border and wall construction in August 1961 raised fears of potential military conflict. The military standoff at Checkpoint Charlie in October 1961 marked the peak of tensions. So this is a reason why we've chosen the Berlin crisis, because we speak about the Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, and during our trip we've seen the Checkpoint Charlie. So it's a good thing. The deployment of Soviet tanks and American forces highlighted the seriousness of the situations, raising concerns about armed conflict. Diplomatic channels and back channels negotiations facilitated by individuals like GRU, Georgy Bolshakov, helped Khrushchev and Kennedy reach a tentative agreement to de-escalate the crisis. Ultimately, the 1961 Berlin crisis underscored the fragile nature of East-West relations and the persistent threat of conflict during the Cold War. Despite avoiding direct military conflict, the events surrounding the Berlin Ultimatum highlighted the precarious status in Europe and enduring tension between superpowers. So yes, I finished my presentation about the major events of the Cold War, and now Woody will explain you the end of the Cold War.
Okay, so now I'm gonna finish off with the end of the Cold War. So it's basically mostly marked by the so the end of the Cold War was marked by the collapse of the Soviet Union, that mostly resulted from many factors, including Michael Gorbachev's reform policies, popular uprising in Eastern Europe, and international challenges within the Soviet regime. Gorbachev was the leader of the USSR and he tried to modernize the Soviet economy and its political system, but its international unintentionally led to its destabilization. There's also the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 that represented the breakdown of the Iron Curtain and the decline of the Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. As the communist regime crumbled, countries in the region underwent rapid democratization and held free elections. Some transitions were peaceful, but others, like the end of the Ceausescu regime in Romania, were marked by violence, showing the varied path of post-communist transition. In the Soviet Union, economic crisis, ethnic tensions, and a political discord escalated. The Gorbachev's reform efforts the reforms of Gorbachev's tried to face the opposition from conservative factions within the Communist Party and the military, but it's the failed coup attempt in August 1991, led by the hardliners against Gorbachev's reform, that weakened the Soviet leadership and sped up the Union's disintegration. And finally, on December the 25th, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as a president, and by formally dissolving the Soviet Union, the Bela-Visa Accords signed by Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus declared the end of the USSR and established the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is also called the CIS in its place. So this Cold War and mostly its end brought a new era of global relations, highlighting the victory of democratic ideals while also presenting challenges such as nationalism and ethnic conflicts. It reshaped international dynamics, emphasizing the importance of diplomacy and cooperation in navigating the complexities of a post Cold War world. So that was the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, comment them down below, and we have the link of the count, and we'll maybe send it on Smart School or something. So if my friends want to say something else. Alright, thank you. And we also have a YouTube video that we could watch. The link is just there.